At the shelter, dozens of families walked past the same cage without a second glance. Inside sat a dog with sad, pleading eyes, his tail barely moving, as if hope had already left him. Some whispered, "He's too old." Others, "Something must be wrong with him." Rejection followed him day after day. But everything changed when one man kneeled in front of his cage, noticing a small, weathered tag dangling from his collar. What he read wasn't just words. It was a heartbreaking truth that would leave him shaken and determined to act. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The shelter was filled with the sound of barking, tails thumping, and the excited whines of dogs hoping to be chosen. But in the far corner, behind a rusted gate, sat one dog who barely made a sound. His eyes followed every person who walked past, quietly searching for the one who might finally stop. Day after day, he watched strangers smile at puppies, cuddle smaller dogs, and sign adoption papers. But when it came to him, no one even paused. His fur was thick and dark, with streaks of gray that hinted at age, though not nearly enough to explain why families ignored him. He didn't jump or bark for attention anymore. Hope had drained from him long ago. Instead, he simply sat, ears lowered, gaze heavy with sadness. The volunteers tried to cheer him with treats, but even they admitted quietly to one another, "He's been here too long. People just don't want him." At night, when the shelter grew quiet, his soft whimpers echoed faintly. Other dogs would curl up with toys or blankets, but he would lie awake, staring at the faint light under the door, as though waiting for someone who would never come. His heart, once filled with love, was now wrapped in silence. Still, something about him seemed to whisper. He hadn't given up completely. The weekend was always the busiest at the shelter. Families with children ran excitedly down the aisles, pointing at wagging tails and bright eyes. Couples leaned close, whispering about which dog would fit best into their lives. The atmosphere buzzed with energy and hope, yet in the corner, the quiet dog waited, his gaze steady and patient. Every time footsteps approached his kennel, his ears perked and his tail flicked, but as quickly as hope rose, it shattered. Parents shook their heads, pulling their kids towards smaller, fluffier puppies. Some wrinkled their noses, muttering that he looked too big or too serious. Others barely gave him a second glance. To them, he wasn't what a family dog should look like. He wasn't bouncy or eager. He wasn't wagging frantically or barking for attention. He was simply calm, too calm for a world that wanted instant joy. And so, again and again, he was left behind. The volunteers noticed his spirit sinking deeper with each rejection. His food sat untouched longer, his head rested lower, and his once sparkling eyes dimmed with every passing family. "It's not fair," one whispered as they stroked his head gently through the bars. But the truth weighed heavily on all of them. Unless something changed soon, he might never find a home. The shelter lights flickered overhead, and with each fading day, so did his hope. That night, when the last visitor left and the shelter grew quiet, the dog curled up in the corner of his kennel. Rain tapped gently against the windows, echoing the heaviness in his chest. The other dogs had settled after barking all day, but he remained still, listening to the silence. His paws twitched as though he dreamed of something, someone who once loved him. But the cold concrete floor beneath him reminded him that dream was gone. The volunteers dimmed the lights, but one lingered near his kennel, heart aching. They noticed the small, worn tag dangling from his collar catching the glow. Most people hadn't bothered to read it. To them, he was just another unwanted animal. But that tag held a secret, a story of a past that explained his calm eyes and quiet spirit. A story no one had cared enough to hear. With one last sigh, the dog lowered his head and closed his eyes. In the stillness, the sound of keys jingling broke the silence. The night shift guard passed through, pausing only briefly by the kennel. The dog's ears twitched, but his body didn't move. Hope had grown too heavy to carry, and sleep was his only escape now. Beyond the bars, life went on. Inside, he waited, unseen, unheard, forgotten. At least, that's what he believed. The next morning, the shelter buzzed with new visitors. Families strolled past rows of kennels, laughing as children pointed at the smaller, playful puppies. The dog sat silently, watching them with steady eyes. When they reached his kennel, some smiled politely before moving on, whispering about how he looked too old or too serious. No one noticed the faint glimmer of his tag until one man stopped, crouched, and leaned closer. His eyes locked on the tiny circle of metal hanging from the collar. The man read the engraved words softly under his breath. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." His voice caught in his throat, echoing in the cold, sterile air of the shelter. The message was simple, yet powerful enough to freeze him in place. He looked at the dog again, not as another unwanted stray, but as a soul carrying a story, a history carved into a single tag. His heart raced as if the words had been left there for him to discover. The shelter volunteers noticed his reaction. One approached, curious about why he lingered. He held up the tag, whispering the words again. The volunteers' expression softened. They had never taken the time to really think about what it meant, but the man couldn't shake it. In that moment, it felt less like coincidence and more like destiny. The man couldn't let go of the words on the tag. He asked the volunteer about the dog's past, his voice filled with urgency. At first, the volunteer hesitated. Records were scattered, incomplete, like the dog himself, forgotten by time. But slowly, piece by piece, the truth came out. This dog wasn't just another stray. He had once belonged to an elderly woman who loved him deeply, treating him like family. Together, they walked through the park every morning, sat by the fireplace every evening, and shared a bond that words could never fully describe. When she passed away suddenly, her relatives had no interest in keeping him. They dropped him at the shelter like an unwanted burden, his only belongings a worn blanket and the small tag she'd left on his collar. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." It was her final gift, as if she wanted the world to remember he was not just a dog, but a soul who had known love. The man's eyes stung with tears as he reached through the bars, brushing his fingers against the dog's fur. The dog's eyes lifted for the first time that day, meeting his gaze with a flicker of hope. The man's voice trembled as he whispered, "You were loved once, and you will be again." For the first time in months, the dog's tail gave the faintest wag. The adoption papers lay on the desk, trembling slightly beneath the man's hand. The volunteers watched in stunned silence as he signed his name without hesitation. For years, families had walked past this dog, blind to the soul waiting behind the bars. But now, in this moment, his story was changing forever. The sound of the kennel door opening echoed through the shelter like a bell of freedom. The dog stepped forward cautiously, as if afraid it was only another dream. The man knelt low, holding his arms open. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Slowly, the dog walked toward him, his paws heavy but his eyes glowing brighter with each step. When he finally pressed his head against the man's chest, the shelter staff felt their own throats tighten. This wasn't just an adoption. It was a reunion between two broken hearts that had somehow found each other. As they walked out into the sunlight together, the dog lifted his head high, his tail wagging with new life. For the first time in months, he wasn't just a forgotten shadow in a cage. He was someone's family again. The man glanced down at the collar tag, running his thumb across the words. "You were loved once," he whispered, smiling softly. "And now, you'll be loved forever."